To take home the golden gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Today's topic is quite controversial. We're going to be talking about the Pegasus affair. That's a reference to the Pegasus surveillance software that was developed by a company called the NSO Group, or sometimes just known as NSO, and the accusations of the abuse of this software by various intelligence agencies, clients of the NSO Group, by largely stemming from research done by an organization called the Citizen Lab that's based in Canada. Proponents of the software say that it is highly regulated, that it is necessary to combat common threat, and that in the climate of increasingly privatized security, it's unavoidable that a software of this type is going to be used to gather information on known threats. Opponents claim that this is the biggest violation of privacy and security since the revelations made by Edward Snowden, and there's been a lot of controversy surrounding these events surrounding Pegasus and NSO Group, and of course Citizen Lab itself. Joining us today is Jonathan Scott, who is who's a researcher on IoT and on mobile devices. He's a specialist in malware, spyware, and forensics. He's actually a founder of a company called Halftree, and he's a mobile security engineer at Cello. He is also a PhD student who has written a paper highlighting some of the concerns about Citizen Lab's reporting about the Pegasus affair, focusing on a specific case. Before we get into the substance of the paper, however, I would like to introduce Jonathan and his work in a little bit more depth. Jonathan, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Thank you for joining us. You mentioned in the beginning of your paper that about your work with human rights activists and their privacy and security issue. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how it relates to your general work and your research in forensics?
Sure. Yes, I've worked with several human rights defenders organizations, and throughout the world, teaching mobile forensics, and specifically working with mobile devices, with Android and iOS operating systems, and essentially teaching ethical mobile forensics is what my goal is, right? So there are distinctions between the way that the mobile forensics are performed right now, and they're rather invasive, right? So let's just say that there's a court order asking for just phone records, but what happens is the entire device is generally all the information is pulled from the device, right? So photos, contacts, documents, things like that. So it gives that analyst, a bias. There's a bias, as it pertains to that specific incident. And this is something that has been brought up by by the U.S. government in their latest, digital forensics document, that there's a bias that actually needs to be addressed when it comes to mobile forensics, because these auditors and examiners have a lot of information that can sway them in a certain way. So my goal is, when teaching ethical mobile forensics, is to teach these human rights defenders on how to actually extract data from devices without compromising other parts of the device that they don't actually need to to access, as well as be able to combat those that do. Let's just say that these human rights defenders are trying to help someone that's been accused of something, and they'll be able to identify if that mobile device has all this information has been extracted when it shouldn't have been, and according to the however the court has ordered. So there's a lot that goes into it, and I've spoken quite a bit about that part of the ethical side of forensics, but that's my goal, is to help teach these methodologies to these people around the world. Definitely.
How do you find these activists and human rights defenders? So how do they find you, basically? How do you connect to them? And more importantly, how do you decide who is worthy of your time? Because there's obviously limited time, resources, and of course, vetting concerns. Who is legitimate? Who might be, in fact, a government agent posing as somebody to infiltrate and to learn new techniques, and who could be just a hostile operative from some non-state acting group?
Sure. They reach out to me, actually, and so for privacy, I'll keep their names out of here. But they reach out to me and ask me for to teach the human rights defenders, and they set up the virtual meetings in classrooms, and then I create the document for them to have after the class is ended, and then of course they can refer back to the document for further instruction and review. But yeah, that's how it happens. Is and these human rights defenders are very prominent people, and so they're well known. But like I said, for privacy, we'll keep it like that. But yeah, that's I've never reached out to any one of the defenders on my own. It's always been them coming to me.
And most of them are from what countries or general regions or areas in your experience?
MENA, so in the Middle East and North Africa.
Mm-hmm. And what, from your experience with them, has been the biggest challenge in terms of cybersecurity and privacy?
Sure, I think it's understanding that different in MENA, that from what I've been told, is that the governments don't really care about efficacy, and really are out to, if they're out to pin a crime on someone, it's what's going to happen. So I think that the challenge for them is to combat the laws of that country in an ethical way, and to be able to provide proper evidence forensically to the courts, and defend the accused properly in a way that will yield them a good outcome, and not have them be put in prison for something that they haven't done. I think the challenge is providing the hard facts that are undisputable, and this is where I come in, and to say these are how you can extract the hard facts from the mobile device, and to show that you have not compromised that device, that you have not rooted that device, you have not jailbroken that device. You don't need to do those things, because they can come back and say, well, you've manipulated this device in order to gain the results that you want. and my goal is to never have to do that. We don't ever have to root them or jailbreak them or install any applications. That's one of the things that I've specialized in my career is never having to install an application on a device, because we can compromise a device and the argument can be made that you've done something to manipulate it. And so that is a huge challenge that hopefully we can overcome by these methodologies that I'm teaching.
Very important work indeed, and I hope it certainly gets wider attention in general. Now, coming back to Pegasus, Pegasus is obviously one of the many surveillance type softwares out there. How did you come to learn about it, and how long have you been working with that particular program in understanding it? And
Sure. So I've heard about it years ago, but in the United States, it hadn't really made waves until about late 2020 and then early 2001 is when we really started kind of picking it up. I started researching more into it in 2001, so I started trying to understand what it was that was affecting the world, and why was Pegasus the main focus when there was so many different spywares out there. And so I started a repository, so a code repository where it was tough to find samples, but I found that there were samples out there, but the thing is there was very limited information about how these how the spyware functioned. So I decompiled the Android Pegasus applications that were released by Google, and I put them all into one central location. And in order for people to study it and for us to understand more about how they functioned, and no one had done this before, so it became as of today, I think it's the largest repository for their older samples, right? They're older Pegasus samples, but at least we were able to actually have one place to study them, and there were only Android samples too. But then I started to question that, well, why were there no iOS samples? Mm-hmm. And why was there was no trace of iPhone Pegasus samples? It started making me wonder. Now, understandably, I mean, I think, I understand it if these samples are out, people can use them maliciously, but there's a point at which people have to wonder, what is it that we're attributing? Like, we've never, if the public has never seen this, and the public doesn't have a chance to actually examine what people are saying is they're being infected with, especially with iPhones, there has to be something else happening here. And so my investigation started, in 2001 into the Citizen Lab, and I started questioning their methodologies to the extent that I started publicly posting and questioning and asking, a Citizen Lab, even back in 2001, like, where are the samples? For in my paper, I cite that they've been studying Pegasus for about 11 years, and in 11 years we haven't had any samples from them, but yet they've been saying that they can tell positively, without a doubt, that what they're looking at is Pegasus spyware from the NSO group, and I would get no response, and so my investigations were really even further triggered, because I really wanted to get to the bottom of this, and somebody had to have samples, and it ended up, everything always led back to Citizen Lab. They were essentially the gatekeepers of samples, and there were only a few institutions that were able to actually get the samples from Citizen Lab, which were Google and Apple, and then that's a Lookout maybe, but there's maybe 3 or 4 institutions, and so that was really troubling to me. And but it was widely accepted that Citizen Lab was doing everything properly but I couldn't accept it because I could never see any technical analysis from them or any samples. And I think that's where it really started to take off.
Now, let's go back for a minute. You mentioned that in the US, the story hasn't really gotten traction until the last couple of years. But quite frankly, the first time I heard about anything Pegasus related was circa 2018 in relation to the Khashoggi affair. Prior to that, there was certainly no shortage of human rights defenders, no shortage of surveillance tactics, but Pegasus was never mentioned in connection to any of these scandals. How can it be that the surveillance that all of a sudden is being used against all these activists and human rights defenders and journalists and other targets, diplomats, officials, whoever, how is it that there was literally no record of anyone's having any significant problems in the media prior to that? Either a surveillance a tool effective or it isn't, either it is widely used or it's not, and either it is used improperly by government actors or it isn't. So what from is there a technical explanation for how that could be?
I think that in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, like you were saying, I think there needed to be some attribution, right? Somebody needed to be responsible. And I think that this is where things kind of snowballed, right? So there's always been, outside the U.S., there's always been talk about, NSO group and the spyware, but if there's any sort of a link to an American or any sort of link to anything American, right? There always has to be an answer, otherwise the American media just doesn't leave it alone, right? And that's just how it is. Unfortunately, it seems as though like NSO group has had a target on their back ever since then. And there's a lot more spyware companies out there that are capable of quite frankly even more extensive infiltration of mobile devices. And Quadream has been known to they were former NSO employees. They have capabilities to perform the same functions. But I think the media focuses on these Israeli companies so much, and I think that there is something that needs to be investigated into that, because why is it that we're focusing on these Israeli companies? And one of the pieces of spyware that's never talked about, and I always bring this up, is a spyware called Triclops, which was created by the NSA, and it's in WikiLeaks, speaks about Triclops. And there's a code base that can be that's available for people to read, and it talks about actually how specifically iOS devices are infected and how they're infiltrated and how the data is extracted, and it's something that is completely kind of just swept under the rug, like it just didn't ever exist. And this is an issue, right? As a lot of the attributions that are being made are conjecture. Right, so they're all guesses. They're all people. It's all still targeted against the NSO group, when it is possible that it is many different organizations, including the United States, the NSA, targeting specific people or organizations. It's not unheard of. It's not uncommon for this to happen, right? It's what's known, right? I do find it very curious that NSO and Israeli companies are the focus, and this is really what troubled me, was there's so many other even American firms, right? American firms that are in this business that are not talked about at all, and so I think that this is a really important conversation to have, and ask, why is the target always an Israeli company, specifically an NSO? What is it that you believe that they've done, and where is the proof?
No, it's interesting. I'll get to the NSO and the various media attributions of assorted activities to them in a moment, but I wanted to circle back to something you also mentioned, which is somehow Citizen Lab became the authority on not only digital rights and surveillance in general, but specifically everything connected to the Pegasus. Can you explain to the audience a little bit more about who Citizen Lab actually is and how they came to play such a prominent role in the sphere and with respect to this particular issue? How is it that they have a monopoly on the Pegasus affair discussions and code?
Sure, absolutely. So I spoke with a reporter, and they said it very interesting, kind of a analogy. They said that there's God, there's the stars, and then there's Citizen Lab when it comes to spyware. And they said, well, what what gave you the the gall to actually come at Citizen Lab and present your findings, and because they're in the stars, right? They are the authority, right? And I said, but that's the thing, is that we as a society have put them there and allowed them to be there. And so Citizen Lab is kind of the brainchild of Ron Deibert. It's a Canadian organization that is purportedly human rights activists and political scientists that are fighting for the good of humanity. And but unfortunately, I think somewhere along the line, something went awry, and it's evident in the white paper that I wrote. All my sources are cited, and I believe that maybe probably in the beginning of the organization there was a lot of a good lots of things that were discovered, but I think there's a point at which, if you're not producing something that is noteworthy, or something that is let's say controversial, or something that can impact the world, I think that you would lose funding. In my opinion was, it would be, yes, you'd lose the funding from people if you're not producing anything. And I remember that back in the late 2000s, Amnesty International came under fire, and even from who works very closely with the Citizen Lab in discovering these human rights violations around the world, and presenting them into the world. They had an issue in which some of their former employees came forward and said that it didn't matter what Amnesty International published. It did matter what they published. They had to publish something that was that could make media headlines, and it didn't matter what the facts were. It had to be something that was controversial and could stir the pot. And this is all public information. This like I said, late 2000s, this came out, and there was a lot of controversy as how much people were getting paid, and etc. I think that the same issue with having to produce something that's impactful into the world. I believe that that's probably something that Citizen Lab came across, because it was interesting that I found it was a quote from the Toronto Star that was speaking about Professor Ron Deibert was speaking to the Toronto Star back in 2009, and talking about how he believed that it didn't matter if what he was doing was illegal, because it was for the greater good. And this is a quote from him. And it was strange, because he specifically talked about placing black box devices into countries that don't allow these black box devices, essentially surveillance devices. He said they have placed surveillance devices into countries in which this surveillance technology would be illegal. And in his own words, he says, every country that we drop these boxes in, it is illegal to do this type of research. He's quoted saying that, the word illegal. And for for an ethical human rights organization like that, it seems as though that there was something went awry. In order to believe that breaking the law, no matter in what country it is something that is to be proud of. I think that this is where that line of efficacy and doing the right thing, it's been crossed, and we start seeing things kind of just go downhill from there.
Now, it's interesting because on the one hand, Citizen Lab claims to be a human rights defense organization, a digital rights defense. On the other hand, some of the reports that came from them were clearly linked to very political controversies and issues that went beyond the strict issue of oppressed individuals in highly oppressive authoritarian countries, but we are talking about political disputes between activists of different and journal and media in different democratic countries, and quite frankly, very, very liberal and democratic countries such as United Kingdom and Spain, ending up under scrutiny for various internal surveillance related scandals that seem to have very little to do with the interest in human rights defense work. How do you explain this mission creep, if that's what it is?
Yeah, I think that this is something definitely to talk about, because I think that the mission is to it seems like there's an agenda, right? That there's a target. It's either let's just say it's the Ecuadorian government, or let's just say it's the Spanish government, or whoever, whichever government is kind of their target on their list. And there's a lot of evidence to show that the people that they're associated with have a lot of influence on what the next topic is, or whoever is funding these funding them have that influence to get their agenda out. And it's interesting because we can see that Soros is a big funder of Citizen Lab, George Soros, and his organizations, and they've been known to fund the Catalonian independence movement, and it's well documented, and there are traces of funds that have been documented, and there's other there's quite a bit of other organizations that I mentioned in the white paper that have funded the Catalonian movement, and it seems as though that there is a drastic conflict of interest as it pertains to the money into Citizen Lab, and then the agenda of those donors. That's we can again, everything's cited, and you can actually see like I said, the conflict of interest in this scenario. And it seems as though if they were truly researching who their donors were and concerned about that conflict of interest, that they would separate themselves from those organizations. But it seems to be progressively over the years in my research, just more donors that were associated to whichever cause that they had at the time. And I'm not sure what the University of Toronto is going to do about that, but it really is a big issue, especially with all of this coming to light. Why is this happening? What are these agendas being pushed?
Now, given what we know about the Catalonian movement, there's been a lot of allegations about Russian interference and support for the movement. And given the role Russia has played in terms of human rights abuses, digital rights abuses, surveillance of legitimate opposition, and its current massacres in Ukraine, one would think that that would raise questions as well with respect to something like Citizen Lab, and in addition would cause at the very least to examine both sides of that particular issue, but it seems not to be the case. Can you tell us, how did you decide to focus on that particular story out of the many that are available, and how did it draw your attention? Why the Catalonian narrative, and what came out as a result?
Sure, absolutely. I decided to focus on this one because it was known as the largest, you know, spying on any group of people to date, right? That 65 people were being spied on that were confirmed by an organization, and it had never that was it was impossible, right? Like this how can this happen essentially? And made world headlines, and I was thinking that's a lot, right? That's a lot of people to be named at one time to be spied on, and to have that confirmed. That's it seemed a little outrageous to me. From what I know about how much it costs. From my understanding and my research, I believe it's something around $155,000 to monitor one person, and then there's limitations as far as how NSO's applications works. You can monitor only a certain amount of people in a year, and because there's limitations on the software application, right? There's a lot of data that's being transferred, and so it seemed just outrageous to me that, wow, that's a lot for and not to say that the Spanish government can't afford it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's a lot to manage, right? That's a lot of even people to manage that, right? If for every one person, essentially you'd have to have a team of people around the clock monitoring these people, and extracting the data, and then probing that mobile device for more, right? Hiding, deleting things. This program is not, you have to interact with it, right? And we can see from screenshots and brochures that have been leaked from back in even 2013, where it's a program where you have to manually interact, and you have to actually push the buttons to actually perform an action. That's how it works. But I think people think it's autonomous, right? And people think that this, once you're infected, then you're all well, I mean, you have to ask it to do something. It's not it's not intelligent in a way that people believe that it is. It's sure, it's very advanced. It's just there's a lot involved that people have to still do. So my question was how show me the proof that 65 people were infected. And so I started reading the documents, and I saw nothing. I saw nothing. I saw a list of people, and then I saw some domains, which they always put these domain names, and I saw no evidence. And then I started seeing Candiru was included in this Catalonian conspiracy, and
could you just about Candiru for the audience, just to clarify?
Because Candiru it's a Windows-based spyware application that's not made by the NSO group, and which is interesting that the attribution that Citizen Lab tried to make in their Catalan Gate report is, they said, well, this individual received a link that looked like something similar to Pegasus, and so we could tell that it was Candiru, and someone else had Pegasus, because it made no sense, honestly. And I wrote about it in my white paper. I said this was absolutely preposterous. They were trying to somehow attribute both of these two different scenarios. One is a Windows-based spyware. The other one is a mobile-based spyware application, and they were saying, yeah, well, we compared them both, and we could tell that one spyware looked like Pegasus, and so that's how we knew. And it made no sense. But this is where it gets really interesting, is because did no one read the document? I mean, if anybody would have read the document, they would have said, wait a second. Can you explain why you're trying to compare a Windows spyware software to mobile software? and two different companies? And how are you saying that these people have been infected by the Spanish government when the Spanish government has never been known to even own or be a client, of Candiru? Ever. It's never been known, and Spanish government has never admitted. There's no documents, and of course there are secrets that we don't know. I don't know myself, right? But it's something that has it. Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. But show us the proof. So there was, I believe it was six total individuals that were said to be targeted, or I'm sorry, there was four. There was four individuals. So there was 3 to be targeted and 1 to be confirmed infected. And the one that was confirmed to be infected, Citizen Lab said, well, we wrote a paper about, we wrote a publication about Candiru, last year in 2001, and we didn't name the person that was infected, but now we're naming them in the Catalan Gate report, and it's a Catalonian, and it was the Spanish government, and it made no sense at all, absolutely no sense. And that person, it was included, and it was Joan Matama. It was included in this 65-person list. It just was mind-blowing. Like, how is it that you are including someone that had nothing to do with the Spanish? How is this possible? And it was even further interesting that one of the authors, who was Elias Campo, was included as one of the people that was targeted by Candiru, and it just doesn't make sense at all. So my investigations furthered, and I found that 86% of the websites that they said were malicious, and they were to be found as they targeted the Catalonians back in April and May of 2019. Either they were expired or they did not exist, and that was very concerning. And the other 14% are questionable because that domain is known to be it's a politically motivated domain, in my opinion, and there's it goes pretty deep as far as, and I specified in my white paper, but the domain is associated to an anti-Tor website. Basically, it's the domain that they're referencing is something that Tor that doesn't support the Tor project, doesn't support the anonymity project of Tor. And that was very interesting to find out, of course, because Citizen Lab and Amnesty International are very deeply involved with the Tor project. And again, even the researchers from Citizen Lab, and working at Amnesty International at the same time of the Catalan Gate report, what is very concerning, as you can imagine, and also the director Ron Diebert as being a part of a member of the a member of the of Amnesty International as well. So I named 3 people that were employed by Amnesty International and by Citizen Lab at the same time during the Catalan Gate report, while it was being researched. That's one of the most concerning things, because it's like, well, Amnesty International is the one that confirmed Citizen Lab's results, but their researchers were working in both places, and so it didn't seem like there was a true independent validation there. How could there be independent validation if the director is sitting on in a group on Amnesty and also directing Citizen Lab? It doesn't make sense to me. So my findings further reveal that even during the time that Professor Ron Diebert, director of the Citizen Lab, says that in April and May of 2022 is when Amnesty International confirmed Citizen Lab's report of Catalan Gate. During that time, 100% of the domains that they claimed were malicious were expired. 100%. Not one of them was active, but yet they created a list of these domains and put it out to the public, to antivirus vendors around the world, and said, you need to add these into your list of malicious domains. Well, I purchased one. I purchased 123tramlights.com, which is to be said by Citizen Lab, it was a 100% positive a fingerprint, for Pegasus spyware. But I owned it. I purchased it right after the report came out, and it was really interesting that it didn't matter if these domains were expired. They didn't. It seems that they didn't even check. Right? They still listed all of these domains as indicators of compromise. So it really, yes, I really went in depth to show, well, all of the information they were giving and all of the people that were purportedly targeted or infected, we have over 55% of the people that out of those, out of the list of 65 Catalonians, 2 of them were listed twice, so essentially 67, right, people, 67 instead of 65, because Roger Torrent who was said to be targeted and by 2 different forms of and some sort of a spyware, right? They don't even name it, right? There's no, it's not, they don't say how or when the date was that he was infected either. So 55% didn't have a date of compromise at all. They don't know. So what was interesting to me is this: if people, let's just say, and let's look at this from a humanistic posture. If you were told that you were infected with spyware by, let's say, NSO Group was the culprit that you got infected, and then you were trying to file a lawsuit against them, and you went to the authorities because you wanted to file a report first, right? Is it there's a crime that happened, and you're right, because it's a crime, a human rights violation, interfering with, spying on it is a crime, right? If that's what's happened. But if you go to the police and they say, well, when did this occur? And you say, well, I don't have a date for that. It starts to be very interesting, because 55% of those people don't have dates at all associated to them. And how is it that they can, let's just look at it again from a humanistic standpoint. They believe that they have been a target of a spyware. So they're living every day, probably in fear that that's still happening, right? Forget the political associations, forget which country they're from. It doesn't matter. As a human, and they're probably worried about their families, right? They've been told that they are being spied on, and there's no help happen. There's nothing happening, right? So they're trying to say, well, can you find out, please? We've been told, Citizen Lab is telling us. And they don't even know when it occurred. It must be really hard to live that way. And I think that we've forgotten about the human side of things. Citizen Lab is telling these people all this stuff, but giving them no answers. And those reports are giving them no answers. And I would venture to say they want to know something beyond, well, we found that you're infected. Well, how? We don't know, but we can see that something had happened. Well, how do we stop it? Well, you don't. It's a very troubling thing that to put on a human to live every day believing that you are being spied on, and to think back on the times that, well, maybe I was spied on in 2019, because some of the dates that they have associated are 13-month gaps. They say, well, you were probably infected, in early 2019, and all the way to late to early 2020. And so now you have this time frame where these people are probably thinking, oh my gosh, what kind of things were they watching? What did I do back then? Imagine the mental anguish happening with these people. And it doesn't seem right that's what's happening. And to say, well, we believe sometime between 13 months, this person was infected. Come on, there has to be more. And this is where the forensics, and I believe that the inability in the of Citizen Lab, to perform these methodologies comes in. And it was evident to me when I spoke to one of the fellows from Citizen Lab in messages on Twitter, when he was asking me questions about how I was able to actually extract data from these mobile devices. And it showed me a lot about the knowledge that they did not have about this industry. And it was very telling. That one last piece I'll tell you is that I published some work on how to actually perform Android mobile forensics properly. I'm actually able to extract data from these mobile devices with timestamps and truly say, this is when the camera woke up. This is when the audio, was listening. This is exactly when the application turned on. And after I published that, you have Amnesty International immediately published the same thing right after. But yet Amnesty and Citizen Lab are supposed to be the authorities, right? They're supposed to be, the ones that we look to for this information, but that's not the case. And it was troubling. The reason that I actually posted this publicly on my GitHub repository, it's called Mobile Forensics Methodologies. I posted this because it was so troubling what I was seeing, with Citizen Lab, that we had to do something right? We could not just go off of their word. And I said specifically, even in my YouTube video, when I was demonstrating how to do this live, I said, if you don't have this, if you don't perform your forensic methodologies in this way, you're doing it wrong. You're not, and ask, and if someone is performing this for you, you need to ask them to perform it so that you can know specifically what is actually happening in the device. And so that you can have absolute attribution with timestamps to the exact second that something has happened. So I know it's been a little long-winded, but yeah, I thank you for letting me speak.
Well, on the basis of what you just said, would you say it's possible, to what degree is it possible that these supposed experts at Citizen Lab and so forth had actual access to the data they claim to have?
Oh, as it pertains to the Catalan Gay report, I believe that there's the likelihood of them actually having evidence is slim to none. Quite frankly, I believe I believe from what I've seen, and the attributions that they've made, especially making attributions to domains that didn't even exist. I believe that they don't actually have evidence of compromise, in order to present to the public. If they did, then, well, we would have samples. We would have, and to say, well, these samples are something that we can't release because they're, it's concern for privacy. Well, that you can redact information, and just as Apple or excuse me, just as Google's team has, produces samples of malware and releases them to the public. They redact the things that need to be redacted, and they produce things so that people can study them, and we can actually better ourselves and fight, fight the good fight, essentially, right? Like protect ourselves from being, monitored. But that's not the case with Citizen Lab, and I don't believe they actually even have the samples at all. I reached out to several people that were said to have been infected with Pegasus spyware, and I did receive a response from someone, and they said that I would absolutely, I could petition, Citizen Lab to have a copy of her samples. And they never responded to me. And so I sent a formal letter to Citizen Lab and letting them know I'm a PhD student in computer science. I study mobile spyware and mobile malware. And I was being given permission by this individual. And of course, I copied this individual, I copied her on an email. And so she could be aware that, and they can see that, yes, she did approve of this, and all my contact information, her contact information was in that email, never received a response. And Citizen Lab specifically stated, well, if it's a proper, institution and a proper, researcher, then and they have the permission of that victim, then we'll release the samples. But of course, as a PhD student, I believed that, well, as studying specifically, what they actually, research, and getting permission from this individual, I thought it would be, enough to obtain samples, and it unfortunately wasn't the case.
Would it be fair to say that accepting funding in exchange for making fraudulent, uninformed representations that cause reputational damage, that cause financial damage, would you say that this may be criminal activity?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is, there's a lot to investigate. Yeah. If you're making fraudulent claims, it is absolutely in order to gain, right, like you said, fraudulent claims in order to gain monetary incentives, in order to sway the public, in order to further whatever it may be, that yes, absolutely, it's criminal, then it needs to be investigated, especially coming to light that the illegal activities that are actually admitted by Director Ron Deibert, those need to be investigated, absolutely. And I think that if we don't investigate, then we'd be doing humanity a disservice, because there are people around the world suffering, believing that they've been spied on, when that's not the case. And we can show that things that Citizen Labs say happened have never happened, because there's no way that something could have happened if it didn't exist. It didn't exist, right? These websites did not exist. How is it that you're saying that they happened, and people are living in fear every day?
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions on a couple of different examples that seem to raise very similar patterns. One was an article published by a Salvadoran journalist in New York Times, circa December of last year, prior to Citizen Lab report accusing the government of El Salvador of using NSO groups spyware to target opposition journalists. This individual claims that he was a target of Pegasus specifically, and claimed that he knows that because his device was infected. But isn't that the case that first of all, that specific spyware is very difficult to trace to begin with, and second, how would he know who was targeting him, given that NSO group sells its software only to governments, and he has no inside knowledge of that?
Right.
How would he make that technical connection? Because in the article, I didn't really see any link. The government not only denied having that software, but said that their own employees were actually targeted by a hack at what seems to be approximately the same time, and may have been the same type of malware that attacked this individual. So to me, that seems very strange. This guy went to the New York Times and made these representations, and Citizen Lab used a number of anonymous stories, but I didn't see any technical evidence of making these representations.
Right. That's the issue, right? And this is where Citizen Lab has moved into the stars, to the point that even I say it quite often, but I think the information security community has allowed Citizen Lab to get to this status, and it's unfortunate that it's happened. that they've stopped questioning Citizen Lab, and it doesn't matter what they publish. It's whatever Citizen Lab says is gospel, and that is concerning. It concerns me that there's really intelligent people in the information security community, and they've just pushed this to the side and accepted it. It's as though they can do nothing wrong. And how is, yes, you're right. These they're rather blogs, honestly, than anything, right? They're not research documents. They're not white papers. What they produce is just, it's like blog posts, to be honest.
Do you think the people who are involved in the alleged examination of these devices have the technical knowledge to make accurate assessment of any type of software?
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. So the let's just say the researchers at Citizen Lab, or even the victims, like, they don't know, right? They don't. The victims will believe whatever is told to them because, well, it's Citizen Lab. I mean, it's you're in front of a divine being, right? it's you're going to believe whatever is told, and that's the unfortunate part. Is they're taking advantage of people.
But do they have the technical qualifications to make this sort of expertise to begin with for anybody?
They don't at all. No. And I dug into the backgrounds of the researchers within the Citizen Lab, and even the principal researcher, or the senior researcher, John Scott Railton. He claims to be a malware researcher, and this is what's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Malware researcher is essentially saying, I'm an engineer. What would be the question that you'd ask? And what kind of engineer are you? Right? Is just to say you're an engineer is a very broad statement. I'm an engineer. Oh, wow. Civil. Are you biomedical? Right? No, I'm a, and you don't know what kind of malware researcher he is, and that's what he claims. And my argument is that if you malware research is such a broad topic. My specific focus is mobile malware, mobile spyware, mobile forensics, and I name it. And I believe that this is very important, because a mobile malware researcher is not the same as a mobile Windows operating system researcher. They don't know how the mobile operating system works. They don't know how, and generally you don't have people that you don't have people that have the knowledge of every single modality within malware. It's silly to think that someone would know everything about every operating system in the entire world. That's essentially what you get when you say you're a malware researcher. It means you know everything, and it doesn't make sense to say that. So John Scott Railton, it doesn't have any, from my research, doesn't have any experience in even mobile, mobile security, even in information security research. He's a political scientist, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Political science is great. It's definitely needed. But how he ended up being a malware researcher and the authority overseeing all the other researchers is puzzling to me. Especially listening to his talks and watching his videos. He always goes back to reference Bill Marczak, and which is purportedly, I suppose, the doctor, PhD, Dr. Bill Marczak. He's a cloud engineer. He studies DNS and domain name servers. He studies web traffic. And but he is not versed in mobile analysis, mobile forensics.
This is a bot specialist, in other words, basically.
He's a cloud specialist. That's it. And the other researchers are specifically they do have a researcher that is claimed to be an Android malware specialist, but they also, Citizen Lab does claim that they don't do Android malware because it's not with it's too difficult, and that's what they claim. They don't do Android malware analysis anymore. And this is, from them, right? They say that they actually state this back in their, I believe it's in 2019, they have a document that actually states this, and that their focus is on iOS analysis, not Android. So to have an Android malware analyst on their team is very interesting. And again, there's no one is qualified. In every author within the Catalan Gate report, there is not one qualified person that is able to actually assess an iOS operating system, and that is very concerning.
A number of major companies, including Facebook, including Microsoft, and so forth, have signed on to lawsuits against the NSO group, using Citizen Lab as expert witnesses to assess the damage. Do you think those lawsuits could at all move forward, given that the expert witnesses are not qualified to provide legal expertise?
I think that they shouldn't move forward, and I think that it's taken, not just myself, but there's, right now there's 120 professors around the world. It just came out today that they're requesting an investigation into Citizen Labs practices, and it's something that I've retweeted. And so 120 professors, qualified professors that to assess, the Catalan Gate report, and it's very telling that 120 professors have said there is no way that what you have published is academically sound. There is no evidence to support your claims, and so for them to be involved in lawsuits is something that should be looked at as well, because in my investigations I found that the lawsuit with WhatsApp and NSO group, it's unfounded, it's baseless, and Citizen Lab was at the core of this, of course, and citing WhatsApp spoke about, they tried to make a correlation between a vulnerability that was found in 2016 and say that NSO was a part of this vulnerability from 2016, when it had nothing to do with a 2019 lawsuit, 2019 vulnerability from WhatsApp. But it seems as though nobody read it. Nobody read that lawsuit, and they didn't notice that there's a CVE. It essentially, it's a, imagine it's if you're not familiar with it, it's a it's a vulnerability description, and talking about like a specific vulnerability on an operating system or a network, and it's documented and cited around the world as saying, here's the number assigned to this vulnerability, essentially. So this vulnerability has CVE 2016-00001, and then that vulnerability is from 2016 because the date is on there. Well, that 2016 vulnerability was referenced as being the culprit, as being the thing that the NSO group had deployed and had created that infected all the Catalonians' devices in 2019, which it made no sense at all. And this is in the lawsuit. And I speak about this in my white paper because it didn't make sense. You're really targeting NSO group and attributing a vulnerability that they had nothing to do with.
I'd like to kind of bring up two things related to what you just said. First, the US government has blacklisted NSO group on the basis of these allegations, specifically brought by an organization based in the US called Dawn MENA, which relies on Citizen Lab reports and on media coverage for these findings. But it sounds to me like the fact that this decision that was made without any consultation with the NSO group, without any fact-checking, was based entirely on politicized, inaccurate, and fraudulent representations that should probably be reviewed immediately. The other issue I wanted to ask you about, and I'm leaving media responsibility here aside because there is none. There has not been any responsible journalism with regards to asking basic questions, but I'm going to ask something else. There was a lawsuit filed by former Al Jazeera reporter anchor Nabil Hadawis against a company called Dark Matter for alleged hack of a device. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, but before it was dismissed, she went to the media, to NBC News, and she claimed that along with other women activists and journalists, she was a target of an NSO group hack. Now, Citizen Lab was her official consultant and supposedly examined her device at the time. How could it be that she was suing one company for the hack of her device while going to the media and accusing another during the process of litigation? And what role would Citizen Lab play in this obvious misrepresentation when the party named on the lawsuit was a different party? Isn't that defamatory?
Absolutely, absolutely. I definitely say it was defamatory, and I speak about the defamation of NSO Group in my paper because it's clear, right? It's clear that there is an agenda and a target on NSO Group, and this is, it's been like this for quite some time. I believe that in that case, of course, there was no proof, right? Like, there's no proof the NSO Group was involved at all. Right.
No,
and
in fact, another party, another company altogether was the subject of the lawsuit, which makes me question, during the process of litigation, the alleged victim goes to the media and accuses another company that is not named in the lawsuit of being responsible for the crime that she alleged, which doesn't make any sense. It created bad publicity without creating any legal responsibility. It created confusion with the courts, and quite frankly, it compromised the stage of litigation it was at. It's a waste of US taxpayers' money in funding lawsuits where there's clearly an agenda that has nothing to do with holding anyone responsible for a crime.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because when we look at actually who's funding Citizen Lab, we can see that one company specifically is a Siphon VPN, and Siphon VPN is owned by Ron Deibert. So Ron Deibert's organization actually funds Citizen Lab, and then we have Risk IQ, we have Virus Total, and we have several other organizations that create software that is helps, let's just say, helps discover vulnerabilities or helps create even backdoors, right? Let's just say that, and we can see that it was said and by several people while I was researching, that it's interesting that the NSO Group is a target, while all these other companies that are actually funding Citizen Lab are the competitors of NSO Group. As a whole, they are competitors of the NSO Group, and it is something to be looked into, because NSO Group has had made a name for themselves as the most prominent investigative company, let's just call it, right, that sells specifically to governments, right? That they made their name known. There's a time where I thought, before I started researching, I thought, wow, this NSO Group is like probably the most unethical, right, company that had ever existed, and then I saw that after my own research, that this is their efficacy is it can be questionable, but it's not as bad as Apple. It's not as bad as Facebook. It's not as bad as Google, quite frankly. And I think that there is a target on the backs of these companies that are essentially taking that, taking the role of these big tech organizations trying to take them down, essentially, like these big tech organizations. I mean, we know that Apple even today released an article saying that they endorsed Citizen Lab, and they gave them funding. They gave them funding and it was just released today because and I retweeted it. John Scott Railton actually posted about it, and he was very happy about it. And Citizen Lab, Ron Diebert, or their name specifically in this Apple document about the grants that were given and for human rights research and preventing spyware specifically. And this is very concerning because there is absolutely an agenda that is involved with Citizen Lab, and it's just come out today. Very, very interesting piece to consider, because when you're funded by people, you're always, I say in my paper, NSO when NSO group is a nail, right? So Citizen Lab is a hammer, and anything the NSO group does is they're a nail. We're just going to keep hammering. It doesn't matter what they do until they're gone.
When
Right?
you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. This sounds to me like a combination of a collusion of
Yes.
of rivals, and their complete willingness to work with mercenary frauds and political groups that could potentially be considered active measures compromising
Absolutely.
US and global security, and that need to be investigated by security agencies for the level of interference that is absolutely devastating to
Absolutely.
security agencies and not just to NSO group.
Yeah, it's
Go ahead.
it's interesting that what you say that WhatsApp, the WhatsApp vulnerability was the thing that triggered the Catalan gate. And how did WhatsApp actually find out that they said 1,400 people were compromised in their vulnerability in 2019. This is April and May of 2019. This vulnerability compromised 1,400 people, and out of those 1,400 people, 100 of those people were from civil society. This is where the 65 Catalonians came in, and this is how the attribution is made. No one ever asked, how did WhatsApp decrypt the phone calls and the data packets from these people and actually in order to say that they were compromised? Because WhatsApp is supposed to be an end-to-end encryption, right? So when you send a message or you receive a phone call, no one's supposed to be able to see that data except for you, and it's no one else. And no one ever asked that question. It's like, how is it that you're capturing this information and seeing specifically who it is that was compromised and looking at the specific packets that were compromised? That it just blows my mind. Like, no one thought about that. And in the lawsuit, no one thought, well, how did you see the encrypted information?
So that raises a question of how these companies, whether those companies were not only useful, willfully blind to the lack of expertise on Citizen Lab's parts, but may have been accessories to facilitate a crime that would benefit them financially at the
Absolutely.
expense of NSO Group's reputation, financial damages, and not to mention everybody else and their own rights and so forth.
Absolutely.
NSO Group, as a result of this, was driven to the point of forced sale and bankruptcy and suffered significant reputational damage and harm. And the dissolution of the company and its battles with the US government as a result could lead to less regulated companies becoming more dominant in the security sphere. What impact would that have on the human rights of various defenders and journalists and other actors?
Sure, and I think that the impact it would be great. I mean, let's just think about this as in a very basic way. Let's say regulations were put on NSO Group, and they were blacklisted entity in the United States. No one's ever come after Apple for the amount of information that they collect on people and the listening that they do on your devices. And all of this is information that's been shown by researchers. Even Facebook, they have accelerometer. It's been found by a research institution that the accelerometer data within your phone is analyzed by Facebook, and they're turning that accelerometer data, all those vibrations, they can read, and they can read that information. They can interpret the words that you're saying based on the vibrations coming from your phone. And researchers found that while the Facebook app was open, that the accelerometer data was constantly being sent back to Facebook servers, and they couldn't understand why. And they finally understood, wow, when you speak, that information is all being sent back, and that's how they're able to create machine learning applications. And of course, there's been a lot of controversy with the amount of information that they gather upon people. But back to your question, is the impact is great, because the less regulated industries, the less regulated companies, it's essentially like they get free passes. They get free passes to do what they want. And in order, and there's going to be a point where Apple is not a spyware company, right? They're not a spyware company. They don't create spyware. They create phones and operating systems that serve people around the world, right? And so they're allowed to get away with essentially whatever's in their terms of service, right? You have agreed to all these things, right? You agreed to have your entire life monitored and sent all your data sent back. And unfortunately, that's deceptive practices, because in generalizing what your terms of services are, that we can collect X data in Y group and combine both of them, and you agree to that. It's so vague and doesn't it doesn't offer the participant the opportunity to deny. You don't actually have the opportunity to deny the terms of service, even to the extent that in order for you to actually go forward to the next step when setting up your device, after you have purchased a product and you've purchased it outright, in order to use that product, you are required to go through that next step of terms of service. You cannot pass it, right? If you pass it, it still is accepted, right? If you find your way around it, it's marked inside of the code as you've accepted the terms. So either way, you've accepted these terms, and then this is when all the logging starts. This is where all the and so for human rights defenders, it's going to be very, very difficult to combat these big tech firms, and essentially it's going to leave them at their mercy, right? Like who's going to try to battle Apple? Who's going to try to battle Google? And so when all of these other let's just say like NSO Group is taken out, and Quadream is taken out, and several other big firms are taken out, who are you left with? Well, you're left with the biggest spyware firms in the world, Apple and Google. And so you're helpless. You cannot do anything about it. And it poses the issue of, well, what's the point? What's the point of fighting? You're never going to win. And unfortunately, that's I believe it's the route that we're going to go. But I believe that we can actually fight this. We can raise more awareness. And I believe that if the truth is coming out about what's actually happening, I believe that we can make an impact, and we can help the human rights defenders that are in it for the right reasons. And unfortunately, I believe that Citizen Lab has veered from that mission.
Well, in the past, the US Congress has unsuccessfully tried to investigate social media giants and other companies for privacy violations, for denial of public platform to people they disagreed with, and various other to various groups of people. But I think investigating them for potential crime, for defamation, for involvement in the fraud, for potential conspiracy with foreign governments even, and for illegal monopolistic practices against rivals in the industry, I think that's a much better way to go than unclear free speech debates that have not led to anything but the strengthening of these companies and their incentives. I think if we are to battle illegal practices and unethical practices with these companies, going after them for actual clearly defined crimes and investigating them for this sort of manipulation is precisely the way to go.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the protests, based off of people being, groups of people being said to be targeted or infected with spyware. I think that the fraudulent claims that are made that incite violence is something to look into, right? Have there been have there been violent protests that have occurred based off of what the Citizen Lab has released to the public, and because when people find out that they are victims of this kind of spying, it is something that can enrage people, right? And understandably, right? You have been violated, and you want this to stop, and you want answers. And I think that these types of things need to be looked into, and then Citizen Lab and all of their cohorts need to be brought to justice, and this needs to stop, right? We're the spreading of fear, uncertainty, and doubt amongst people around the world has to stop, and Citizen Lab is at the core of this this propaganda that's actually spreading everywhere.
Thank you so much for your valuable time and for this information, a very thought-provoking paper. I hope you continue research into these issues because there's clearly a ton of more work to do. I hope you share with me afterwards the article and the tweet that you mentioned because I'd like to take a look at that. And I'm going to do something that I usually do not do, but in this case, I think it's more than warranted. I'm going to publicly invite somebody from Citizen Lab to come on my show or to submit a response to these allegations, which I will consider and I will publicize, and I promise not to editorialize any of these responses and to give a fair hearing to any technical or other explanations they choose to give. I believe in fairness in journalism, and unlike some of the media that they currently work with, I will give them the right they have denied to many of the victims of these campaigns, which is a right of response. That is the responsible thing to do, and this is what legitimate journalism is all about. So Absolutely. If anyone from Citizen Lab is interested in responding to this discussion, they're welcome to contact me and to join the Washington Outsider Report in a future program.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining this program. We will be back next week at the usual time, Tuesday evening, 9 p.m. This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us was Jonathan Scott. We were discussing Citizen Lab, the Pegasus affair, and NSO Group and allegations against that. Thank you so much.